And it gives me real pleasure to introduce my lovely colleague at the Centre for Myth, Cosmology and the Sacred, Mary Attwood. So Mary is co-founder and director of the Centre. She's an art historian, author, mentor and business creative. She's co-founder and director of Channel McGilchrist and was the founding chairman of the Victoria branch of 90,000 members strong The Art Society. Is a qualified practitioner of yoga, meditation, mindfulness, published 2 books with Watkins and another book, an ancestral family book with the CFHT last year. Mary holds a BA Honours degree in the history of art from UCL and Birkbeck, where she focused on late medieval and Renaissance art and architecture, and holds an MA with distinction in myth, cosmology and the sacred from Canterbury Christchurch University, where she researched Renaissance art and art's effects in general on the viewer or beholder. So Mary's teaching and research seeks to offer a renaissance of art and consciousness through a broader understanding of art, not as an object to be analysed, but as a bridge between seemingly disparate ways of understanding the world and our place in it, while honouring the historical and the broadening perceptions of art beyond rationalising analysis, categories and styles, opens doorways both to us and in the image. And beyond this, Mary believes that how we look at art can reveal ways of knowing and seeing that change not only what we see in art, but change us and the world, and can help meet the complexities of modern living by offering a renaissance of humane values. So over to you, Mary.
Thank you so much, Louise. Thanks, everybody. It's lovely to be here today and see lots of familiar faces. Little bit different to what I normally do because it's going to be slightly more theoretical, but we will do a little practice with an image and engaging with the image and see what that brings about. So do make sure that you've got a pen and paper to hand if you'd like to participate in that. So this talk is called A Renaissance Painting as a Living Myth. And this is my personal experience with one particular painting. I'm not saying that we should all be able to see the same things, but there might be some common threads which come through when we look at an image together. So the painting that we're going to be focusing on, and I'm going to bring it onto the screen now, so that while I'm talking, just allow yourself to engage with the painting, to look, to observe, and just see in your very slow process what evolves for you. So through this talk, I don't really want to offer a closed, or I can't offer a closed definitive word about myth, but rather to explore the unfolding of thought and meaning that might arise in the landscape between the image and the seer, us, the viewer. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of background just to place us in some sort of context, and then we'll go a little bit deeper. So these wonder-filled images which blossomed out of the golden age of 15th century Florence are frequently rationalized and over-intellectualized, and the myths that are carried through them, therefore, and by them, often remain encased in a literal meaning of a myth as a concept. The modern eyes that view them perhaps no longer appreciate their beauty at the very least, let alone how the myth arising from and through them might become something living, which weaves its way in greater or lesser intensity into our thinking, our feelings, altering our perceptions, not only of the story that is told through the painting, but in how it might enlighten our understanding and how we see the world and ourselves in relationship with it. I think a life lived without any mythical dimension to it is a very flat life, whereby when we're faced, as we inevitably are, with difficulties, harshness, loss, betrayal, death, suffering, adversity, as well as true joy, the flourishing of life, flights of the heart and imagination, love, trust, loyalty, and the value of all relationships which come upon us without us realizing, we have a depth and strength which was not there before, and we're able to see things both as they are and with a more discerning understanding. I mention this here because in our world today, we're very removed from great myths that might save us relegating them to just an entertaining story or a tragic story, but one that has little relevance to our own lives. Instead, we do have deprived myths in our world today. But when a myth is brought into our visual field through a great painting, an image of the sacred in this sense, it may remind us of compassion, love, the fragility of life, the suggestion of a greater life, and the acceptance of life as it is, and stops us from becoming hubristic. I would even go as far to say that they may even save us from the madness and insanity that we're currently experiencing in our world. A focus on excess, consumerism, exterior looks, gain, greed, and at the polar opposite to that, a paranoid fear of life, an overemphasis on the human being as isolated from anything else, and with mental health issues continually on the rise. We have been taught, wrongly, to look only to the surface of things with a singular, tunnel-visioned cycloptic eye, so as to prevent us from feeling anything that might lift us out of our current states of depravity. Art galleries and collections are becoming sanitized for fear of offending, but let us not forget that these great, beautiful images may help open our eyes to a vision of the world and each other, and remind us of the depth of myth we could recover if we knew how to look. The myths we see from ancient Greek civilization and also early Christianity really show us the foundation of life, of truth, beauty, love, greater human qualities that we may aspire to, but never attain, but need to be reminded of them nonetheless. They do not lull us into a hypnotic state where we only see illumination and beauty, but they can also make us feel unsettled. We see warnings, darkness just behind the curtain, for good reason. So to give a brief outline of what I'll explore here, firstly, I'll talk a little bit about the eye. Secondly, about how we look. It's really about how we attend to an image that will bring the image to life, and for the myth that it carries to weave its way into our thinking and our understanding. And thirdly, I'll consider the image and myth it conveys in its multiplexity. And of course, Leonardo da Vinci's fascination with the world of phenomena, and how perhaps through Leonardo's painting in particular, he really brings us back to that tactile world of phenomena, and that myth is not some lofty idea out there in the world. It's in the very fabric of the earth and in our bodies. So in ancient Greece and during the Renaissance, the eye was absolutely primary as the most important sense. A double vision and meaning of seeing in its broadest sense is to both look and to understand. The myth through a painting is actually there to guide our vision, so it can eventually find its way back to its integration with the imagination, the heart, reason, the body, and an acceptance of something ineffable that we must never know fully and cannot know. And key to this, as I said, is how we look. So when we move into a slower way of seeing and thinking, it takes us out of linear time and space and into a different relationship with time. It's broader and it's expanded. If we just analyze it, it will remain in the realm of logic, rather than moving into what the great art historian E.H. Gombrich called the beholder's share, where both image and seer activate each other, where we see and are both seen, and the space between us and the image gives rise to our personal experience. Writing on active imagination, Dr. Carl Jung further illuminates this sense of seeing as participatory for both seer and seen. Looking, he writes, psychologically, brings about the activation of the object. It is as if something were emanating from one's spiritual eye that evokes or activates the object of one's vision. I'll also consider the image and the myth it conveys in its multiplexity, which includes Leonardo's fascination with the world of phenomena. This means that even down to the techniques he employs, the way he has shaped and placed his figures, the landscape, all play their part in telling the myth through their relationships to each other, forming the whole. a metaphor in itself, because for Leonardo, painting is at the pinnacle of how best to express nature, and of how the symbolic really is embedded in the fabric of the earth, as the pigments for the paints are from the earth itself. I met Rishi last year at a symposium called Nicole Baden, excuse me, and she runs a Buddhist monastery in Germany. And she paraphrased her Zen teacher who taught his students Buddhist practices based on learning how to look at paintings, and in particular for him, those of Cézanne. And he said to her that if we learn how to see art, we learn how to live. Each of us are unique, like paintings themselves, and each of us are changing, while something also remains the same. The ways in which I have encountered works of art is not to say you must all do the same in the same way, but I can only say that through learning to look and see, to encounter works of art in ways not necessarily encouraged by academia, changes how we understand life. And with that, the myth becomes something living rather than a concept. Some paintings, and this one included, have been my friends, my beloveds through my life, through different times, and different images will become more present than others at different times. When we consider this in light of transformative learning and intuitive inquiry, Rosemary Anderson writes that beloveds are not only intimates, but those occurrences, places, and curiosities in life that claim a person before he or she even knows them well. So in that way, this should never be prescriptive, but there are different approaches and conditions we can make space for, which are not new trendy ways of looking at art, but are instead recalling old ways of looking and seeing which have been buried in the centuries since the Renaissance. And with that, we must always return to the image itself. Meeting it in its own realm, that of the mythos, means we can start to enter its story space and understand it differently. We can stand slightly apart from it too. We mustn't lose ourselves entirely in the image and recognize it as its own being. And in this way, we won't conflate the image by making it all about us and imposing ourselves onto it. So we need here both openness and restriction. And as McGilchrist says, it's the right hemisphere that actually inhibits. And in this sense, it becomes really paramount. So while we're sitting here with this image in front of us, you might like to just take a few minutes quietly to allow your eye just to explore, wander, pause, move. Let your eye guide you around and through the painting, the figures, and just make a note of any observations, any questions that come up as it starts to come alive really through our gaze. So do carry on looking and observing and writing if you're writing while I continue. I think sometimes when we encounter a painting like this with figures from the Christian myth, we can often feel indifferent unless we're Christians. But after a while, just by looking, the beauty we see before us may begin to touch us. In his 1432 treatise on painting, the Renaissance humanist Leon Battista Alberti described the historia, the story, the myth, as the most important aspect of painting, and all an artist's efforts and co-creative process was to bring the myth to life, to be experienced moment by moment, and not as a historical event. While looking, our eye wanders, pausing, then moving, as it is drawn to different parts of the painting. Mary's movement, pulling her child towards her, while he urges in the opposite direction. The submissiveness and perhaps also slight awkwardness of the lamb, showing innocence, Jesus' sacrifice for humanity, and perhaps sacrifice in general, the rocky ground, the expanse of the landscape. But then a feeling of discomfort may arise, for we see things not as we do in the norm. Anne, Mary's mother, is much larger than Mary, and her grown-up daughter sits on her lap as a throne, her eyes lowered but looking at Mary. And through their glances between each other, we also learn how to look and how to respond to each other. And sitting out in a rocky space, in a landscape which looks both partly real and also perhaps a place in the imagination, it doesn't seem fully as we might like to see things in the world. Unsettling, perhaps mysterious, with open-ended questions. Leonardo's use of sfumato, which literally translates as going up in smoke, is a technique he developed which softens the transition from light to dark and from dark to light. A metaphor too for the transition of the soul's journey, as well as in our own understanding, and in how we try to touch and see the divine. He cloaks this in the enigmatic, as it should be. For while he articulates in paint the most beautiful three-dimensionality and robustness of figures, where in their very presence they recall the great marble deities from ancient Greece and seem to come alive before our eyes, he acknowledges that there is a dimension to the cosmos that is unknowable to the human intellect, no matter how penetrative our visual powers may be. With this, it becomes maybe not so much paradoxical, but a coincidence of opposites brought before our very eyes. In us glimpsing it, this vision we see gives rise to the words and ideas that form our understanding of the sacred and reminds us of the responsibility we hold in the way we look and see, as in understand, that we shouldn't try to see what we cannot see, but to really see what we can. There is a soft elusiveness we see here as the figures emerge, moving and breathing, and then they become still again, where they seem both everyday and otherworldly. So, as painting for Leonardo was the greatest expression of nature a human could create, the same principles are embodied and embedded within his paintings, and in so doing, impart those ideas onto us, even if we do not realize it or have been able to articulate it in those words. In the story space of the image, Leonardo takes us through his love of geometry as an expression of the cosmos. Geometry's primacy for Leonardo was due to geometry being the cosmos's governing architecture, which gives rise to necessity. Mathematics, geometry were part of the fabric of the phenomenological world. The fascination with natural phenomena, as Leonardo showed throughout his lifetime, and his insatiable sense of wonder and discovery to really understand how things work, reveals this much more integrated and inclusive view of the world. Wonder and discovery preoccupied Renaissance thought. And here we see the experience of life in a beautifully articulated image, with the human being central to this, the separateness of the secular with the sacred in our modern worldview would have been a completely alien concept to the Renaissance mind. While Leonardo liked number and arithmetic, they had what he called a discontinuous quantity, which they do, whereas geometry dealt with continuous quantity. Geometrical proportions were magical as they gave form to the invisible. It was how Leonardo created his paintings. It dealt with forms, shapes, surfaces, space. It opened the doors of understanding for his fascination with natural phenomena. On his notebook pages, he focused specifically on drawings of shells and flowers with geometrical improvisations. The 5 platonic or regular solids in geometry, which include the tetrahedron, hexahedron, and so forth, which include the triangle, pyramid, cube, are what Leonardo used to create his figures on the canvas. He would splice a geometrical form, a section in one of the solids, and he would put it into perspective as a real object rather than a diagram and give it 3-dimensionality. And he became so good at doing this that he was able to not even measure his figures when he created them. He already had it fully formed in his mind, modeling them in light and shade through their geometrical form. And this is what we see before us. Mary and the Christ child and the Lamb form a pyramidal shape before us, which takes us into a continuous flowing movement of how we engage, of how we see the spiraling, flowing forms of the figure. And here we can see some of his drawings, his sketches, and the study for the sleeve of the Virgin, where the spiraling, flowing forms of her drapery are as much a part of the cosmos as the cosmos itself. When engaging with an image, as in life, we need both movement and restraint, or we must return, as Rilke says, that vast circle must close, no matter how large it is. And here we are, guided by the very painting itself of what we see into this mode of movement and restraint. We see the economy with which Leonardo paints and shows this continuous flowing forms, but they're held together in this sense of wholeness of the image itself. Here's another study for the leg of the Virgin, and this sort of wonderful movement that we sense through it, but with stillness at the same time. So this is born really of Leonardo's imagination, this image, and at the same time he's drawing from the fabric of the earth. He believed the body, the human body, was the living earth. It was made of the same stuff as the earth. The interactions between this group of figures preoccupied Leonardo for much of the last 20 years of his life, as his many and varied drawings reveal. We can see his sketches here where he's brainstorming. He's fascinated by this movement, this pyramidal form of the interaction and relationships between these figures. As Mary reaches to bring her child back into her arms, she simultaneously knows he has to be let go. And it's this friction, this tension between the prophetic deep sorrow in Mary and pure love and joy at the newness of life in her young baby that gives this painting its exceptional quality. In this moment of opposing forces, what we see is not neutrality, but an apparition of harmony brought about by these opposites. Ian McGilchrist writes, for opposites to coexist, they clearly cannot cancel or annul one another, but must rather give rise to something new, a form of harmony, as in Heraclitus's lyre. But note, he says, that this harmony is not to be taken merely in the ordinary sense of concord, but in the sense of tonos, tautness, from which we get our word tone. This is also, by the way, what is intended by the golden mean, not a flabby compromise, but a position in which taut synergy produces a dynamic equipoise. The deeper meaning and values of what makes a human being better, or of what we can see but maybe never attain, is that which coexists both in the cosmos and in our relationship with it. They show us that great and true values exist in the cosmos, in the very design of nature, of how it behaves, and as humans, a microcosms of that greater cosmos, we're reminded of these qualities and of our part in something larger than us. As we look more closely through their gestures, their glances, their facial expressions, the implied movement of their bodies, we are told of the movements of their soul, animating them, each one unique, as each living being is, but working together to tell the story. On the most human level, Mary is the compassionate mother, but so too is Anne. But she shows a different compassion to that expressed by Mary. She is more stoic and solid, and has already accepted both Christ's sacrifice and Mary's future suffering at his death, whereas Mary is in the throes of her realization and transitioning into acceptance. This is probably the last painting Leonardo worked on before he died. And he never finished it. There is something in its unfinished state which also leaves open a sense of the enigmatic and the mysterious. It is in the coming together of the very human qualities with greater governing cosmic principles, with Leonardo's almost superhuman ability to show in paint the movements of the heart expressed through the face and the body. While Anne has already made her transition to acceptance and solid witness, we witness Mary in the process of her spiritual conversion. We realize that you cannot have a great love without deep sorrow and loss. But the more we look, the more we might see, and the image changes. Leonardo died before he completed the face of the Virgin. This he left to last in his process. We see Mary's humanly spiritual conversion as she accepts the inevitability of Christ's death. She moves from being mother of Christ and someone who wants to prevent his death to someone who accepts it and moves into the mother of God. Leonardo's creative and skillful process as divinely inspired artist allowed the rest of the painting to take form, the invisible to come through, and the final part, the spiritual transformation itself, working in the face of the Virgin. In the Virgin, we see joy and sorrow simultaneously, which also tell us something of the fabric of life and the cosmos. As McGilchrist writes again, the emphasis on simultaneity applies not just to individual experiences, but to whole categories of existence. Thus, we are used to thinking of the individual and the general, the temporal and the eternal, the embodied and the disembodied as exclusive pairings, whereas they are not only inclusive, but, as it was possibly Goethe's greatest insight to see, are present simultaneously in one another. They are found not by turning one's back on the supposed opposite, but by going more deeply into it. Thus, the general is found in the individual, the eternal in the temporal, and the spiritual in the embodied. This tension is creative, generative. A tension between opposites is at the heart of all creativity, not just in maths and science. So we can see then that the tension between opposites throughout the painting and the figures, and most poignantly in Mary's face, is the creative thinking of the cosmos itself, expressing itself. So why this particular painting? Interestingly, I only decided about 5 days ago that I was going to change my topic, and I was initially going to speak about Eros and Psyche. And I think the personal experiences we have with an image and its story, we don't always need to say so fully. But for me, this painting emerged last July again, I think. I've known it for years, but as like people and relationships we have, they come and go sometimes, and they come back into our lives at various times. And in September, when there was the death of someone very close to me, this painting seemed to carry me through somehow, and it called me back. I'm sure it will leave again at some point, but perhaps it won't. I think that's why contemplating an image such as this matters for us today, for through it we experience a depth of emotion and feeling that can be held by the image itself. Through this, we see the entire cycle of life. We see new life, youth, old age, potential death, suffering, and resurrection. We see an entire cycle. Carl Jung said that images are the higher counterpart to emotions, without which emotions in themselves become corrosive. In a world where we are fed degraded myths in the images we see, this surely lifts us to something much greater, but to which we are intrinsically connected. And this image tells us that we could become within and without and never fully accomplish it, but shows us nonetheless, and we redeem these feelings through the image. The Sufi poet Rumi said that there is some kiss we wait for our whole lives for, the touch of spirit on the body. And in some sense, when we experience the story, the myth, through an image as a living being, as something which weaves its way into our thinking and into our lives, we do experience this sense that we are being touched by something quite different, perhaps. For despite how remote to us some of the subject matter of the Renaissance image may seem to be, whether we see a virgin enthroned or distant gods, there is always something in the gesture, the movement, the facial expression, or in a silent thought that we can all recognize. Something familiar meets with the forgotten, which we feel in the everyday, impulses that seem to govern us, enmesh us, or that we see in an expression of another, helps to lift these isolating human emotions into something much larger than us. And I would say when you step away from an image, just take your eyes out into nature and you might notice aspects of the image through the nature around you, or you might perhaps notice something different in the interaction with another human being, another soul that you haven't seen before, or perhaps with an animal or a tree or a rock where they're sitting in this extraordinary landscape. So just to give you a few more minutes to observe, look, and have a think about this painting. So I would say also just open yourself to whatever comes, whatever feelings you feel, but be anchored by the image itself. So keep returning to the image. And just note down anything, insights you might see, sort of different symbolic or metaphorical meanings. It might remind you of something very earthy. I mean, anything at all. There's no wrong with this. Allowing your imagination, your heart to open and breathe it in and exhale it at the same time.